what happened as the result of Jehoram's battle with the king of Moab? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 2 Kings on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 2 Kings chapter 3, verses 20 to 27. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 20. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 2 Kings chapter 3, beginning at verse 20. Now it happened in the morning when the grain offering was offered that suddenly water came by the way of Edom, and the land was filled with water. And when all the Moabites heard that the kings had come up to fight against them, all who were able to bear arms and older were gathered, and they stood at the border. Then they rose up early in the morning, and the sun was shining on the water. And the Moabites saw the water on the other side as red as blood. And they said, "This is blood. The kings have surely struck swords and have killed one another. Now, therefore, Moab to the spoil." So when they came to the camp of Israel, Israel rose up and attacked the Moabites, so that they fled before them. And they entered their land, killing the Moabites. Then they destroyed the cities, and each man threw a stone on every good piece of land and filled it. And they stopped up all the springs of water and cut down all the good trees. But they left the stones of Kir-Haresath intact. However, the slingers surrounded and attacked it. And when the king of Moab saw that the battle was too fierce for him, he took with him 700 men who drew swords to break through to the king of Edom, but they could not. Then he took his eldest son, who would have reigned in his place, and offered him as a burnt offering upon the wall. And there was great indignation against Israel. So they departed from him and returned to their own land. This chapter gives us the beginning of the reign of the 9th king of Israel, Jehoram, the son of Ahab. Jehoram came to power after the death of his brother Ahaziah, that we saw in chapter 1, and during the latter years of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, who had at the time a co-regency with his son, also named Jehoram. After the death of Ahab, Moab, which had been paying tribute to the kings of Israel, rebelled. It is this rebellion that Jehoram is trying to correct and bring Moab once again under the subjection of Israel. However, Israel's army was not very strong, having been recently defeated by the Syrians, and so, like Ahab did, Jehoram sought help from Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And like with Ahab, Jehoshaphat agreed to help. But he did so without consulting the Lord first, which led them to having a lack of water as they traveled to Moab through Edom in the south. Jehoram was ready to give up before the battle started, but Jehoshaphat wanted to hear from a prophet of the Lord, so Elisha was called. Elisha told them because Jehoshaphat was there, the Lord would provide them water, though indirectly, from the storm that would come elsewhere. But they were to dig trenches in order to collect the runoff. The Lord would also deliver the Moabites into their hand. And that's what we see beginning in verse 19. The water came in the morning around the time when the morning sacrifice would be offered at the temple, which was a way of keeping time in a society with no watches. Now it was about this time that the Moabites got wind of the impending attack. No doubt there had been people in the south of Moab who witnessed the coming armies and so sent word back to the king to prepare for battle. This would have taken time and would have likely have begun in the days before the water came, but on the day the water came was the day the battle began. Now the Moabites had looked at the stream on the other side of their borders in the morning sun and saw that it was colored red, which they thought was blood caused by the kings of Israel, Judah, and Edom turning on each other and killing one another. If this was the case, the armies would have been in disarray, meaning that it would be easier to attack and win. However, the Moabites were mistaken in this, for what they were in fact seeing is the reddish tinge of the morning sun reflecting off the water that Jesus refers to in Matthew 16 verse 3 as a sign of foul weather in the region. And so when the Moabites attacked, the armies of Israel and Judah were ready and fought the Moabites back into their territory. But if that wasn't enough, They continued taking city after city, stopping the springs of water and cutting down all the good trees. In doing this, some accuse Israel of disobeying Deuteronomy 20, verses 19 and 20, which seem to forbid this. But a closer look at that passage, which is lesson 62 of our study of that book, makes it clear that Israel was barred in doing this in order to end a siege and quicken the end of a war. That was not the case here, and so they didn't break this law. However, that doesn't mean the battle wasn't fierce, for it was. The king of Moab then took 700 men who drew the sword and tried to break through to the king of Edom in the hopes of killing him and perhaps fracturing Israel's army, but that failed too. It was so bad, the king of Moab took his firstborn son and offered him as a burnt offering upon the wall to his god. Now, why would the king of Moab do this? Because they had the belief that if they offered that which was most precious to them, their offspring, in this case the future king, then their God would fight for them and give them victory. In truth, Jehovah, the true God of heaven, despises us offering human sacrifices on an altar to him, as we are made in God's image. This was forbidden under the law of Moses in Leviticus 18 verse 21 and Leviticus 20 verses 1 to 5, and not even the evil Ahab or Jeroboam had introduced that into their false worship in Israel. But seeing this happen did create great indignation against Israel. It's hard to determine if the indignation is on the Moabites' part, because Israel brought the battle to this point, or on Israel's part in fear that the wrath of God could come upon them for taking the battle to the point that the king of Moab would do this. But regardless, the battle ended here, and everyone returned to their land. Moab was defeated, but not entirely, for in 2 Chronicles we will find that there would be another war between them and Jehoshaphat that 2 Kings doesn't mention. As for Jehoram, we don't read of him getting his tribute back, nor do we read much else about him by name until the events surrounding how Jehu, his successor, kills him. That won't be until chapter 9, though, as in much of the interval between now and then, the author of 2 Kings gives us much of the work of Elisha, the prophet. Much of chapter 4 will deal with two events that sound very similar to events that occurred during the days of Elijah, though they are different, so we hope you'll join us for those lessons. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 to 7, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.